Here we are, Julie.
Yes.
Words with God. Wow. Words with God course. Julie, thank you for doing this with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for writing this book.
Yeah. Thanks for...
You've done the hard work. I'm
no,
just happy
you
to
were,
be here.
and we'll get into it later in the course, but you were a massive part of that journey and that book becoming a reality.
I did create a lot of beautiful growth opportunities.
You did. You also created some small humans that provided great material as well, great stories in the book. No, but your
team effort.
Your love, your support throughout that whole process was incredible. And I'm so grateful we get to do this together and talk about words with God.
Yeah, let's get into it.
And you know, the words with God, the idea, trading boring empty prayer for real connection, there's dual meaning there.
Yeah.
And we're going to go after both of those in this course. But the first is, how do I have words with God? Is there a right way to pray? Is there a wrong way to pray? How do I engage with God in a way where he actually engages with me? Am I just yelling into the distance, and is God just engaging with me? Is he there? Is he not? And there's a lot of people who navigate that. Then the other part of it, which I think is a natural response to it, is how do I have words with God when it seems like God doesn't want to have words with me? Yeah. How do I express that frustration, that pain? How do I move through that?
Or when you deeply believe that God is disappointed with you.
Yeah.
Like, I do think of it in the context of our children, when they pull away, when they just seem like they're not giving us themselves.
Yeah.
There's typically something behind the scenes, some level of shame that's trying to convince them that we don't want them near us.
And I would say when it comes to prayer specifically, and I've had a lot of conversations with people about this, okay? Shame, guilt, most people feel guilty or shameful or disappointed when it comes to prayer. There's very few people that are like, I'm nailing it in prayer. Like, I've got this whole prayer thing down. If you think about it, you look at all of the books, all of the courses, all of the teachings on prayer, and yet the vast majority of people, and if you look at different stats, I mean, some stats say less than 2% of people feel good about their prayer life.
So there's so many books written about it, though. So are the authors of those books, are the people putting this content out, do they feel like they're killing it?
Yeah, and that's really...
I'm asking you.
That's the question that we're going to engage with. I'm not getting into that yet. But that's the question that we're going to have to face, that we're going to have to answer.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why we struggle with the idea of prayer is because prayer has been reduced to a transaction, not the most intimate place of transformation. And I even think of a moment that we had earlier this very week, with our sweet daughter, Elizabeth. And she came downstairs. It was like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, came into our room, bawling, just in tears, so frustrated. And she said, Dad, she ran over to my side of the bed, jumped in bed, and she said, Dad, I keep having to restart my prayers. I start, and I mess it up, and then I start over again. Because for her, she wanted to get every word right, every phrase right, every request right, because it all feels important. It feels necessary. It feels weighty. I mean, we go to God in prayer with things that are very important to us. We're talking...
And a little content around... I love that you called her Elizabeth, but she's our Lizzie.
She is.
She is a unicorn human. And she has been known by her sister, who she shares a room with, mostly as someone who prays for so long at night. And Sophia had told me a couple days before this, you don't even know this, she asked Lizzie one night, what is it that you pray about for so long? And Lizzie said, well, that's between me and God. And so she's known as having like 30 minutes. She goes to sleep praying. And so this night we had put her down to sleep, and then she comes in with her sister because they don't want to come downstairs in the dark alone. And she's just distraught. Like, I can't go to sleep, and I'm tired, and I keep falling asleep, and I'm doing it wrong. And I feel like the context of who Lizzie is, her wild nature, she just doesn't really follow a lot of structure in any areas of life, that she would feel so bound in her relationship with God, in her prayers with God. Was really very heartbreaking to me, because of the way I see her wired naturally by God.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
No, I think that context is amazing. And I think that's the story for many of us, whether we're a wild Lizzie or someone who's more given to order and structure.
Yeah.
There's this sense that what we've been presented as prayer has left us lacking. And that's what I want to go after, because the narrative when it comes to prayer is so often that you're either the hero of your prayers, meaning like you're killing it. You're praying for the right amount of time. You're using the right words. You're doing the right things.
You're consistently
praying. Whatever it is that puts you in the position of hero over your prayer life, or you're the villain. You've messed up. You don't do it enough.
Yeah.
You don't do it the right way. And so God doesn't engage with you. But I love this definition of prayer. So when I was working on Words with God, I was studying all these different thoughts and practices and stuff around prayer. And we'll get into the story behind Words with God in the next session. But I found this definition from Paul Tillich, and I love this. He says, the essence of prayer is the act of God who is working in us, and raises our whole being to himself. An act of God working in us and raises our whole being to himself. So my question for you is, who's doing all the work? Based on that quote, who's doing all the work when it comes to prayer?
Clearly God.
God is.
Working in us, raising us to himself.
So, but when we talk about prayer, that's not the story that you hear from people when they talk about their prayer life.
Yeah.
When they talk about whether they feel good about their prayer life or they feel like they're engaging with God, you don't hear this story of God working in them and raising them to himself. You hear mainly like this insecurity of, I'm not doing this right, or I'm not doing it enough. And if you look at the Lord's Prayer in Scripture, this is one of those few moments where Jesus actually gives us what could be considered a formula. And we've used it as a formula. And it's bound by religiosity. And people, they have trauma when it comes to how the Lord's Prayer is used and how it's abused. And the truth is, though, this isn't a formula. The Lord's Prayer is not a formula. It's a framework. It's a framework for prayer. It invites us into the rhythms of prayer. It invites us. It's the raising. It invites us into a sequence of prayer. First of all, setting the stage for how we engage with God and how God engages with us. Then helping us understand what it is to navigate the real challenges and pains and opportunities and promise of what it is to be human, of what it is to navigate a life that is dangerous and wonderful and confusing, and confirming all of those things. And it's tragic to me that so many of us don't realize what prayer is all about. And because of that, we think we're bad at prayer. And this is what I hear from people too.
Yeah.
They say, Addison, I've been following Jesus for like 20, 30 years. I can't tell people that I feel like I'm bad at prayer. And people are going to look at me and be like, hey, you've been a Christ follower for long enough. You should know how to do this. You need to get your stuff together.
Yeah.
Like, you're just not doing enough. You're not doing the things you've been taught. And that's...
Or could it also be that they will discount the power of prayer because look at this person, where they're at, or the size of their church or ministry or their life, XYZ, and they haven't been praying. So maybe we don't actually need
like maybe, based on their idea of prayer. And I had a pastor reach out to me after reading Words with God, and he told me, he said, Addison, you've been pastoring, I think, for 20, 25 years. And he said, Addison, I've never read a book that opened my eyes to how expansive prayer is and how much of my life is actually a part of prayer.
Yeah.
It's like there's so much of my life I didn't realize was a part of prayer.
I love that.
And he said, but I've also never read a book that challenged me more to pray and to see my life as an outflow of prayer.
Yeah.
And that's really like, that's my heart for this as we move through this. I want to deconstruct that idea of prayer that is transactional. I want to break down the idea of prayer as just another thing on the list. Yeah. Another box to check. No, prayer is not
something else I'm not getting to.
Something else I'm not getting to.
There's not enough hours in the day for.
Correct. It's like, no, prayer isn't another thing on the list. Prayer is the thing that energizes and focuses and clarifies everything on the list. So
Yeah.
we'll get into this in a later session. We'll talk about a life of prayer.
Yeah.
But if Paul's going to say things like pray without ceasing in 1 Thessalonians 5:17 and Romans 12:12, then prayer has to be something other than what we've known it to be. Because there's no way we could pray without ceasing if we're just using or engaging with the type of prayer that most of us think of when we talk about prayer, when we think about having words with God.
So what would you say to someone who would read the scripture, pray without ceasing, and think it's just metaphorical, or he didn't actually mean
Like it's hyperbole.
yes, pray constantly?
Yeah, I think we answer that question in session 3.
Yeah.
Hey,
I
we
feel
need
like
to keep
a
them coming.
ping-pong ball.
We do. We need to keep them coming back to each session. We want to tease that. But no, that's a really great question. And that is a question that we will dive into in session 3,
Excellent.
because I really do believe that that is a key to unlocking prayer in our lives. So we're going to talk about the difference between quality time with God and conscious time with God, and what are the different expressions of prayer. What all is included in the robustness of prayer. To be honest with you, I think a lot of young people are turning to other forms of spirituality. I'll call it DIY, do-it-yourself spirituality, whether it's Ouija boards, crystal, occult, whatever it is they're looking for a form of connection. They're looking for a power beyond themselves, and the powerless, the bland, the transactional view of prayer, which that point of connection with God that we're offering, isn't a true representation of God's heart and God's design for them.
Yeah.
So they're settling for shadows. They're settling for copies.
Yeah, man, that's so good. I mean, it's sad. What would you consider a young person?
Well, there's a lot about Gen Z in particular being more interested in that kind of stuff. Like there's been a resurgence of it.
But I feel like there's also this beautiful resurgence of like recognizing who God is and seeing those glimpses.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that's other.
Yeah.
That's beyond anything that I have seen or that can be even like fabricated by AI. That is other.
Yeah.
And that's what I want.
Yeah.
You know, that's part of the beauty of living in a time and space where we're exposed to so much, is that then when that next level is presented to us, there is this awareness of like, oh, there's nothing else like that.
That's what I've been looking for. Like, there's a lot of novelty in our
Yeah.
world today. There's a lot of schemes. There's a lot of presentations. There's a lot of get healthy, get well, get whole, all of that. And the truth is, Julie, I think one of the reasons why we feel so dislocated, so isolated, so confused when it comes to purpose and promise and provision and peace is because we've forfeited so much of the robustness of prayer. I think a return to prayer, as God designed prayer to be a part of our lives, an intimate part of our lives, a holistic part of our lives, I think a return to prayer is actually the solution for so many of the problems that we're trying to navigate, the fruit of the problems that we're trying to navigate today.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to what we were touching on earlier, is this idea of the hero or the villain of the story, of the prayer. And what I want people to hear today is like, God doesn't need you to be the hero. He doesn't need you to be the villain. He just needs you to be a participant.
Yeah.
He needs you to say yes to something that is beyond even what you know how to say yes to right now. That's the thing about God. The way God moves in our lives is if we just say yes to the things that we know to say yes to now, then we develop the strength and we find the perspective and the awareness to say yes to things that seem beyond us. Every act of obedience, every act of trust enlarges our lives, enlarges our sense of self, so we can engage with things that previously seemed beyond our ability to grasp or understand.
Yeah.
And I think so much of prayer is actually that shift from, God, I'm trying to grasp you. Like, I'm grasping prayer. If you even look at people in general, I remember recording this in the book, but over 90% of people pray. Even people who don't believe in God will pray when the situation is right, or I should say the situation is wrong.
Yeah,
like
very wrong.
Very wrong. They will pray. And there's this innate desire that we have to connect with God.
Isn't that cool?
To reach God, to know God, to be known by Him. And honestly, Jules, I think some of the frustration that we feel when it comes to prayer, the discontentment, is actually healthy.
Yeah.
It's actually good that hey, you know what? This transactional idea of prayer that has been a large part of my formation in religious circles, actually, this isn't a good representation of God's heart for connection with me and what it means for me to connect with him and through him with the world, whether that's my purpose or that's provision or that's relationships or whatever it is. So I'm excited.
I'm going to jump ahead. You're going to be like, don't talk about that.
I'm going to say this belongs to session
later.
X. No.
But I am thinking of the comparison between our relationship with God and marriage. Because I remember being young and not having a lot of examples of marriage around me that looked appealing in the least. It was very much that transactional, like, he works, she stays home, she can buy what she wants, he can do what he wants. So much separation.
Wow.
Like you're saying, that transaction. And it was hopeless for me, looking at those marriages thinking, this is it?
Yeah.
This is where we're headed? And the reality that settling for that would have killed any desire for that type of connection.
Wow.
Where it's just this, you're over here, I'm over here. We interact in a way that benefits one another, but is not intertwined.
Wow. This is a place of disappointment. This is a place of confusion. This is a place of uncertainty. And so we need to be honest about that. And I think a part of being honest is moving through the truth that what we've been presented about prayer is at best a partial truth and in some senses a lie.
Yeah, a complete warp.
And just rest in that. Be like, wow, am I willing to look at prayer completely different? I mean, I think there are people watching this right now like, I've given up on prayer. And I just ask, like, I'm asking them, stay with us, because I think by the end of this journey, we're going to have a fresh view of what it is to pray, what it is to be people of prayer, what it is to have words with God. One of the things, though,
this isn't deconstruction for the sake of deconstruction.
No, we're not here throwing stones because it's fun to throw stones. Although sometimes it is kind of fun to stand on the side and throw stones until you realize, wait, I'm actually not doing anything. I'm not in the middle doing the hard work of rebuilding. I'm not figuring out where these stones go, what their right place is, what it looks like to contribute to the meaningful struggle to recapture the vision, the prophetic vision that God has for this person, for this moment, for this field, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so
there's nothing lasting when all you're doing is throwing stones.
There's not.
You know, once when I was young, I went around at about midnight with my friend.
Oh my gosh. Is this a stone throwing story? Is that what this is?
I was like 9, and legitimately we're like, hey, let's just go throw rocks at people's houses. It would be fun. So we did. And then
did you choose like old broken down homes, or did you go after the really nice ones?
The really ridiculous part of this is everyone who lived it was like a church neighborhood. Okay. So everyone who lived there we had known.
Oh my gosh.
Pretty much our whole life. So we're throwing rocks at like her grandparents' house. And sure enough, her grandpa did come over the next day, and we had to do some form of, I don't know, child labor for recompense. But throwing stones is just not a good way to spend your time. Is your point that
it's fun to throw stones?
It was fun. It was when you said it's sometimes fun to throw stones. I was like, it really is sometimes fun.
Okay, hard transition away from the stones. As much as I love that story,
I prayed and.
Yeah. Okay, so for a lot of people, you're hilarious. A lot of people, when it comes to prayer, they're like, okay, I reached out to God. I checked the boxes, if you will. I did what I was supposed to do, and God is checked out. God is silent. God is unresponsive. I went through that moment. I needed that thing, and I reached out to God, and I felt like God left me there by myself.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of prayer, as far as like people are like, hey, I'm done with prayer, or I'm done with faith. Like in that moment of need, in that moment of trial, God wasn't there the voice, if you will, was silent. And Words with God, I spend the first 2 chapters of the book going after specifically the voice, hearing the voice, and this idea of traveling into silence. And I think we need, before we go on, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that it's difficult. Like when Jesus told us to pray, Our Father, it's difficult for a lot of people to pray to God as Father.
Yeah.
Like their idea of Father is this phantom, is this person who maybe moved in and out of their lives, someone who wasn't there, someone who was harsh with them, someone who abused them. It's a very complicated relationship for a lot of people. And yet Jesus at the very beginning of the prayer is teaching them to pray, Our Father. And so when you couple those two, like how difficult it is to pray to Father for a lot of people.
Well, and then
with an hour, which we're getting, that's a later session. The mystery of hour.
I hope people are taking notes on everything you've said is at a later session.
They're going to check and be like, did he come back to this at a later session? No, hopefully I will. No, we would definitely will. The
but
fifth
I'm thinking
session.
hour because you're recognizing, oh, this is my sibling? Ugh.
Right.
Or, yeah.
Right. But the focus right here is not so much on the sibling. It's on God.
Yeah.
And when we have a father figure in our lives who feels absent, and then we pray to a God who feels silent, I mean, that's complicated. Trigger everywhere. And there's something that I want to share as we move into this course and as we move into these lessons or these sessions, is that one of God's languages is silence. And I know y'all are like, hear me say, they're like, I don't like that. Like that's weird. What do you mean? But like, how can you have a language that is silence? One of the reasons, though, why God brings us through silence and into silence is because we actually need to unlearn the voice of the accuser, the tone and tenor of the voice of accusation. Sometimes that voice sounds a lot like our Father's voice. We have to unlearn that voice so we can learn and hear and understand the subtle, the intimate, the tender voice of God. Otherwise, we expect God's voice in prayer to look and sound and feel the way the voice of accusation feels. Because so much of our world, so much of our formation actually happens through a spirit of accusation. Mm-hmm. And the accuser wants to come along and he berates us with these thoughts of inadequacy, these thoughts of rejection, these thoughts of making us the hero or the villain of prayer. Whereas God is inviting us into a place of knowing and being known that is terrifying. And that's why a lot of the saints, the mystics, they'll talk about this dark night of the soul, this journey into a darkness, into a separation, this jump into fear, this dive into fear, where they actually come alive and they come to know God in ways that they could never know Him before, where they know themselves in ways that they would never have known themselves before. And the enemy's scared of that.
Yeah.
Enemy doesn't want us taking that journey. And if you even look at Jesus' journey of sonship, you have this moment where the Father proclaims beloved identity over the Son. You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And then the Spirit of God leads Jesus into the wilderness. It's not the accuser. The Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness. And then what is the first thing that the accuser says to Jesus? If you're really the Son of God, do something practical. Mm-hmm. Do something spectacular. Do something wonderful. Prove that you're the Son of God. Mm-hmm. Prove it. And a lot of us, like, that's the voice that we hear. And Jesus moved through that. He grabbed hold of the truth, the promise of who He was. And in that journey of tension, there was a hope that was fulfilled and that was realized. And so what I want to share with people today is like, hey, the journey into silence, that is actually not a journey of rejection. It's actually an invitation. It's an invitation to let go of ideas of how God speaks, of how God forms us, of how God meets us in our moments of need, to let go of these ideas of who we are. We have to face off with all of those in the silence. And there's this beautiful quote from Maeterlinck And it goes, and I might be paraphrasing, but it goes something along the lines of, we do not know each other yet. We have not yet dared to be silent together.
Yeah.
And I think for many of us, we haven't dared to be silent with God because we're scared of what's on the other side of the silence.
Or we believe we can't do silence.
Yeah.
That silence is for the holy.
Or for the lazy.
Or the lazy. Or the elite. Like they've reached a level of silence where, I mean, culturally, in this day and time, there's very little silence.
Yeah.
And even waiting in line or any kind of pauses in your day, you fill and call it productivity. So there's a reframing of silence that has to happen as well.
Like, what is silence for you?
Silence for me is setting aside distractions.
Okay.
So it's eliminating, taking away distractions, making the space, setting aside the time, waking up early is a lot what my silence looks like. And then just being, knowing that thoughts will come and there will be distractions, and letting the wins of not following those distractions. The distractions in and of themselves is not a failure. It's when I say, this is here, this will still be here when this time is done, but this space is sacred. And like anything, the more you do it, the more you want to do it, the more you long for it. You have a desire, a hunger for that space that is sacred.
It is. And you're describing more so the practice of silence.
Yeah.
And which I love. And we're going to talk about that.
What
as well.
were you asking?
I'm more so talking about letting go, the silence of not allowing that voice to be the voice over your life. Your idea of what success, your idea of what purpose looks like, your idea of who you should be or could be, all of those things that are good, because the enemy of our souls is brilliant in the sense, like he's going to take some truth when he presents the lies. Like he knows better than to just serve up a lie. So I'll always find things that have a fusion of truth, but a lot of lie. Mm-hmm. And so for me, silence is that holy ground, that trust, that denying.
Open hands.
Yes, that surrender of like, I don't even understand how this is possible.
Yeah.
This is difficult. This is messy. This is not sure footing. This is terrifying. But
or I thought I knew.
And that's really scary, like the unlearning. Like this actually had a form of fulfillment or a form, like it worked.
Fruit even.
It was fruitful, but it leaves me lacking.
Or it was meant for that season and it's no more, but it doesn't discount what it was then.
It was. But it's like, God, you're reaching me in ways that I couldn't be reached before because I'm understanding things about myself that I didn't understand before. And when I look at Jesus and I look at what he says, hey, no one knows the Father except me.
Yeah.
And what he's saying this idea of what you have, of what a father is, no, like actually I am the representation. My life, my work, my sacrifice, my love, my goodness, my faithfulness, my self-giving love for you. This is actually who the Father is. This is who the Father has always been. The idea of the Father has been shrouded by religion and elitists and people who needed control, and so created a God in their own image and projected that image of what it looks like to engage with that God on everyone else, reducing prayer to frameworks, reducing prayers to mechanisms. He's like, no, actually, look at this connectedness that I live as far as how I live with the Father and the Spirit. And he looks at him in John 14, 15, and 16. He tells him, he says, hey, it's actually better for you that I go. It's better for you because these things that I desire for you. And he's specifically talking about, in these chapters, the revelation of the Father. And in John 5 to John 17, he uses the term the Father over 100 times, describing his relationship with God and what they, as his followers, were being invited into. He's saying, hey, this is true, and this is ultimate, and this is ultimate reality. This is ultimate truth. But you can't grasp this right now. Like you can hear these words, and maybe there's people who listen to this like, man, I've heard these words,
Yeah.
but I don't feel grasped by these words. And he looks at him, he says, there's so much I want to tell you, but you can't bear it. Like you can't grasp it. It's like, but when my spirit comes, my spirit's going to teach you, not by head knowledge. My spirit's going to infuse your spirit. My spirit's going to come and occupy that space of knowing and being known. And things that are external, things that are at arm's length now are going to become internal. They're going to become intimate. You're going to understand them in ways that you previously couldn't understand them. And that, for me, Julie, is the great promise of prayer. It's the point where every truth converges. It's the point where our pain and our promise converges. It's the point where heaven and earth converges. It's the point where forgiveness and temptation and trials, when we look at the Lord's Prayer, it's this prayer of opposites, if you will. It's a convergence, it's integration. You have heaven and earth, God's will versus our will, forgiveness and reconciliation, trials and temptations and deliverance and victory, all of these coming together because that's where life happens.
Yeah.
It happens in that intersection of pain and promise. And as we end this session, I actually want to read the final couple paragraphs of the first chapter of the book. I worked really hard on this language. I was like, I could share this or I could read it. And I want y'all to hear this. I asked that everyone listening, I can't do this because I'm reading it, but you can even close your eyes and receive. I mean, you don't have to, but
After dinner, I'm going to read to you.
I'm going to read to you for
an
a
hour or two.
reference. Let's see if anyone can get that reference. But I want to read this because what feels like rejection when it comes to prayer, and I shared this earlier, is actually an invitation.
Yeah.
And the enemy of our soul wants us to believe that the rejection is final, that the rejection is because we don't do prayer right. We don't get the words right. We don't get the motions right. We're not in the right posture.
Again, making it about us.
Making it about us. We're not holy enough based on our idea of holiness and what it is to engage with God. But I want to read this to you because I have found that this moment, this journey of prayer, it's a rite of passage. And a rite of passage is a moment where there's question marks about who we are as sons and daughters. The rite of passage is actually where there's a period and there's an exclamation mark.
There's a threshold.
There's a breaking forth.
Yeah.
There's an awareness. There's a discovery that we're invited into that we can only know if we travel through the pain, through the trial, through the wilderness. And this is page 21 in the book. And it goes, and the dangerous truth is that the canyon is the pathway home. And in this chapter, I describe the canyon as that place where we hear echoes of our own voice and we wonder, like, is that God's voice? That thing that I'm hearing, is that me? Or is that the voice of God? Is God speaking to me? Or am I just creating something in my mind because I desperately want to hear from God?
Oh man, and when you like share something with someone that you believe you've heard from God and they're like,
You're like, what? Just be careful not to throw the "Thus saith the Lord" on the front of that when you do that too. That's another point. We're actually going to get another session 3. People are going to have a list of that. Anyway, going back to this.
Really should have read the notes.
I'm going to start from the beginning, but I wanted to give that context about the canyon because that's important. And the dangerous truth is that the canyon is the pathway home. Like a child sent into the wilderness for a rite of passage, so our journey takes us into and through the silence. It's in the canyon that we wrestle with God and discover who we are and what we're capable of. It's in the canyon where empty words are exchanged for a real connection. It's in the canyon that we face off with our ideas of God, prayer, and many other things so we can surrender to the universal mind of Christ. It's in the canyon that we figure out that a prayer life is much more than a spiritual exercise. It's the higher consciousness that reorders and integrates life, reclaiming every bit of living in us as holy and necessary to God's purposes and design. The canyon silence helps us join our voice, our holy amen, our holy so be it, that vote of trust, that vote of faith with the voice again, for even in the canyon's echo, the voice speaks. Amen.